Welcome to Audiation in the Wild with your hosts, Beau Taillefer and Eric Rasmussen. Season 4, Episode 2, Dr. Molly Gebrian and the Neuroscience of Practicing, Part 2. Well, it's good to see you again, Molly.
Yeah, welcome back for the second appearance.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you guys again.
Cool. Well, we wanted to have you back to honor the release of your new book, which is fantastic, by the way, and everyone should get it immediately.
Thank you.
So I re-listened to the first episode we had covered with you, and we went pretty deep into the spacing effect, which I didn't recall, actually. But what I wanted to start with about your book, because there's a lot of amazing information about the science of learning and how to apply this to, and performing, how to apply this to an instrument. But one of my favorite things about the book is actually the way you start it with the emphasis on problem solving, because I have seen people, I've seen musicians specifically, they start picking up pieces about the science of learning, whether it's interleaving or the spacing effect or all kinds of things. But when this problem solving piece is missing, those other techniques don't really apply in quite the same way, because if you're not getting to the bottom of what's causing the mistakes in the music or your overall mindset about learning things, it can deeply influence how you're going to learn pieces.
Right.
And this actually, when I first started reading about different great musicians talking about practicing, this always kind of surprised me in a weird way, where I'd read a book or read an interview or watch an interview with a great classical guitar player or something, and they were always talking about problem solving. They were never talking about, not in the same way as students were thinking about how many times am I playing this or anything like that. That was always kind of like a separate tier. The emphasis was always more on solving problems and getting to the root. But I'd love for you to maybe unpack that for a bit for us, because I think it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I mean, to me, if I had to define practicing in one word, it would be, I guess maybe it's two words, problem solving, right? Practicing is problem solving. And if you're not doing that in the practice room, you're not going to get the results that you want, right? Because you're not getting to the bottom of what's causing whatever you're hearing that you don't like, right? And, a lot of times when I talk about the science of practicing stuff, people are like, well, can you give me like a monthly template and I'll just like follow it and like do what you said on your template? Or I had a student once who was working on a piece that I was also preparing for performance. We were working on the same piece at the same time. And he was like, oh, well, you just tell me what you did and I'll do exactly the same thing. And I'm like, okay, you fundamentally misunderstand what practicing is, because I'm going to have different problems than you, right? If you replicated my practice exactly, it wouldn't work, right? Because you're not solving your own problems. And so, yeah, I really wanted to start the book that way, because the whole rest of the book is basically problem solving tools, right? But if you don't know how to use those tools and you don't realize that they're problem solving tools, you're not going to be able to apply them in a way that's very effective. So yeah, to me, practicing comes down to you're solving the problems that you hear and that you notice about your playing. And most people just need better tools to do that. And so that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, definitely. And that really comes through. And I think one thing that's, we're all teachers here, but we can often see this in students where their conception of practicing is often repetition based, which isn't necessarily totally irrelevant, but often the single metric is how many times do I have to play this, not what's the ratio of correct or incorrect or anything nuanced like that. It's just how many times do I have to play this. And I think it's really important for musicians, even experienced musicians and teachers, to once in a while take inventory and think, what do I even think about practicing? What is practicing? What are the strategies that I use when I have a challenging passage or something that I can't audiate well? Because there's different strategies for different problems. And you mentioned a little bit in the book this research on self-regulated learning and the processes of setting small goals, trying a strategy, reflecting on how it went. And I think that whole meta learning perspective and thinking about how you even practice, how are you setting up your practice, how long are you working on a passage, or how many repetitions, or what are your criteria for moving on, or what's your criteria for which strategies you're using. I think the return on investment for thinking about these topics is absurd. in efficiency, and not even just efficiency, but quality as well. Because a lot of us hit the point where we're willing to practice whatever it takes. If I got to play this 1,000 times in a row, I'll do it. It's just if that's not the most efficient and effective way, I don't want to do that,
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, we all have limited time, right? Like, and I am someone, inefficiency drives me crazy. It's like one of my biggest pet peeves. I'm a very sort of calm, easygoing person, but something that will get me really riled up is inefficiency. Like, what are you doing? You are wasting so much time. And I think that's part of what brought me to this work of exploring the science of practicing, because I could see the inefficiencies in my own practicing. I'm like, why am I doing this for hours and hours and nothing's happening? Like, I'm not actually getting better. There must be a better way to do this. And I think you're absolutely right, what you said about students, that students are using the wrong metric a lot of times. It's like, okay, how much time do I have to practice, or how many repetitions do I have to do? And that's not the metric. The metric is, what do you want to accomplish? What are your goals? How are you going to know when you reached your goals? How are you measuring that, right? And yeah, I mean, the research that I kind of start the book with is this research that shows, okay, well, what separates a great performer? And that's used very broadly. It could be an athlete, could be a musician, could be an actor, whatever. What separates a great performer from someone who's less great? And it's how they practice. It's not any kind of innate ability that they're just better automatically, or when they start, they're doing it at a higher level. So obviously they're going to reach a higher level of performance. It's all in how they practice, and what you were touching on about, like, very specific goal setting and knowing exactly, what am I looking for? What do I want this to be? How am I going to reach that place? Yeah, I just think that's so important. It's a different metric, and it's critical.
Mm-hmm. I know in high school, we always, turn the great musicians into these godlike people, right? And it's like, oh yeah, I heard he practices 4 hours a day just to stay where he is, because if he didn't practice that much, he would go backwards. Because he's so good, he has to know everything. So he has to put in all this time just to stay where he is, forget about getting better. And that was that's the culture, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the culture is practice as much as you possibly can. The more you're practicing, the better, right? And it's all about amount of time rather than quality of work. And I think last time, like you were saying, last time I was here, we talked a lot about the spacing effect, that, taking breaks on purpose is really enhances learning and helps you learn faster. I think part of the reason people are so reluctant to try that is, one, it is very counterintuitive, right? That you take more breaks and you're going to make more progress. But also it goes against this culture of the more time you practice, the better you are, and you're more a virtuous musician or whatever, because you're spending all this time in the practice room. You're quote unquote lazy, right? If you're taking all these breaks and not practicing 5 million hours a day. And so, yeah, it's a big hurdle to get over, but it's worth it.
No, that is we talked about this last time, but the culture of classical musicians and jazz musicians specifically have such intense practice regimes in different ways, obviously, but there is a lot of similarity. The term I've coined for this is pseudo discipline, where people they do something like playing something 100 times in a row as a badge of honor of this kind of discipline metric that they have to hit for some reason to be good at something, rather than employing a strategy that is efficient and that works. So if the strategy was play it 100 times in a row, and that's what the research showed, I'm sure we'd all just bow down to it and say, great. But these like pseudo discipline ideas come in where people are like discipline signaling. They're like, I practiced this passage for an hour straight, or I did this. And it's very just fascinating to see that whole thing, because the research is just obnoxiously clear in so many different domains that a lot of those strategies, like hyper massing things and on a daily scale, or even in one practice session, may not be such a great idea for memory and for just actual performance. And
but
yeah,
you get to brag to your colleagues and say, look, I spent 6 hours in the studio today. How about you?
I love the pseudo discipline. I think that's so right on, because it actually takes more discipline, I think, to put something down and say, no, I have done my work on this. It needs to sit now. I think that a lot of the sort of I don't know, almost crazed practicing that classical and jazz musicians do of, I spent 6 hours a day on this one measure, look at me. I think a lot of that comes from anxiety over, image and just the way that our training culture works. Like if you make any little mistake, it's like the worst thing that has ever happened, right? And so it takes a lot of trust in yourself and also for me in the science to be like, okay, I did my 5 minutes on this and now I am taking a break because I'm going to come back to it later and that's going to be more effective. That takes more discipline, I think, for a lot of people than just the kind of mindless massing of repetition. So pseudo discipline, I love it.
Yeah, I actually have like a 30,000 word manuscript like typed up about
a manifesto.
About this phenomenon, because it's so, I mean, there's been a rise in people like Cal Newport talking about deep work and 60 to 90 minute sessions, and learning has to be effortful. And I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of those points, but I think it can be taken to the point where it's not actually helpful. And I shared this before, but I switched from, I did an experiment where I went from doing 60 to 90 minute practice blocks and I did a graded classical examination for guitar. And then I did 2 grades higher, but I only practiced in 20-minute blocks. I just ran that test and I scored higher on that. And I did practice the same amount of time per day, but I only ever practiced in 20-minute blocks.
Yeah.
And for me, that I just did that as kind of proof that this idea that you have to be working on something in 60 to 90-minute blocks, it isn't really true for musicians specifically. And this is, very challenging music. This isn't, this isn't music that you can just sight read or something like that for a guitarist. And
yeah, I've done similar. I wouldn't call them experiments because they're not formal enough, but like, sure. I have learned pieces where I literally only have 5 minutes a day to work on this thing. Like usually it's like an etude I've assigned myself, or like a piece that I really want to learn that's sort of outside what I have to prepare for performances. And so it's like, okay, well, I want to learn this, but I really literally truly only have 5 minutes a day. I'm going to spend 5 minutes on this thing. And it always amazes me, maybe it shouldn't, but it always amazes me how much progress I can make on something only working on it 5 minutes a day. Shouldn't amaze me because the research is very clear. Yeah, you can make a lot of improvement, but it's always so like, why do we spend hours and hours and hours when you can accomplish a lot in very little time?
Yeah, and I'm sure everyone here has had this insight, but once the spaced repetition or just the spacing effect really dawns on you, I think most musicians realize I could have learned way more music.
Right.
And I actually had the experience recently, like I was learning some lower level classical piano pieces. Piano's not my main instrument, but I'm experimenting with these things 10 minutes, 15 minutes total per day. And I'm just flying through music.
Yeah.
And I had the feeling like I need more sheet music. I don't have enough music in my house to learn. And that wasn't the experience I was having like 10 years ago. I was
right. Yeah, when
it's cool.
It's very cool. I mean, when I first started really experimenting with taking breaks was early on in the pandemic, as I think we talked about last time, because I was honestly scared to try it before. Like, if it didn't work, I was kind of screwed if I wasn't prepared for performances. And, early on in the pandemic, there were no performances. So, yeah, I was kind of mad. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. This works so well. I could have spent so much less time. I could have learned so much more music, so much faster. Like, why did it take me like my whole life to try this?
Yeah. So a little test or experiment that I've been running in my own practice in the past couple of weeks, I based off of this problem solving mindset in practice, I went a whole week. I recorded every practice session and I spoke out loud on the recording what I was doing and why I was doing it before I did it.
Nice.
And then
cool.
I would listen back to some of these periodically, like a day or two later. And yeah, I mean, I'm very steeped in this research. I know about this stuff and I still found that profoundly helpful. And I probably won't record every session like that with that degree of, clarity, but I think it's probably useful to do something like that once in a while, just to make sure you're not getting into just mindless replaying of things and just being very clear with yourself. Like I'm using this strategy. I'm going to interleave or play something 3 times in a row and then vary. And you're being very clear about what your metrics are for changing strategies and And yeah, it was really cool.
Awesome. I love that you did that. So for the last 2 years at the University of Arizona, I've been teaching a course on the science of practicing. Now I'm at New England Conservatory. I'll be teaching that course here at NEC. And one of the very first assignments in that course is exactly that. Students have to practice for, however long. I think it's only 10 minutes because I don't want to watch them practicing for 5 hours, but, practice for 10 minutes. And I ask them to narrate out loud, just like you said, this is what I'm doing. This is why I'm doing it. This is the problem I'm trying to solve. And it's so interesting to see students' reactions after they do this when we come back to class and we kind of discuss their experience, because most students are like, yeah, I saw the assignment and I was like, oh my God, this is so annoying. This is not going to work. I don't want to do this. Or like, I do that in my head. Why do I have to like say it out loud? And then when they actually do the assignment and they watch their video back and reflect on it, universally, everyone's like, okay, wow, that was like massively helpful. I got so much more done in those 10 minutes than like I ever usually do in like an hour. So I love that you did that. Yeah, I recommend everybody do that. You don't have to do it every single practice session, but it's a very worthwhile exercise.
And the results, they compound.
Right.
So I have this Bach piece I'm working on has this like one measure. It's just like, it's in 12/8 and everything is in division. So there's a lot of notes per measure.
Yeah.
Right? But there's this one measure it's not difficult to audiate, but it's such an odd shape, like chord shape on the guitar, because there's 2 lines, and it's not a chord shape that you normally learn. So it's not a chunk that you have in your memory from before. Even if you've been playing for 20 years, it's unlikely you would have encountered this exact shape. And I have no problem playing it just slightly below tempo, like, 140. But I can't play it at 150. It just always falls apart. And I was speaking with Eric about this recently. I had a breakthrough with this passage in the last couple of weeks from just getting really experimental and strategic about which strategies I'm using. And my insight was it wasn't that it took me a year to learn this. It took me a year to find the strategy to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And it's a very different way of looking at it, because it sounds this took a year to learn, but I'm pretty sure if I just applied what ended up solving the problem sooner on, it would have worked. And I did have to use quite a few strategies to get it solved. And I was doing lots of mental practice and reviewing it many times in a day. And I had to do it for like 5 days in a row. And then I left it for a few days, and now it's just locked in. And it's very, it's just exhilarating when you try something like this. And now because of these recordings, I was listening to myself, okay, this wasn't working, and you listen to these, little recordings of you narrating your practice. Now I know I have this technique that when I encounter something that's this challenging, this is what I try first now. And I don't have to go through that process. And you can see how this would start compounding over time, where you start getting more, razor sharp about how you approach things.
Exactly. I love what you said, though, that you had to go through a bunch of strategies to find what works, because like, that's always going to be the case, right? You're always going to come, like, no matter how long you live and how good you get at practicing, there's always going to be a problem you've never, ever encountered before, right? Just because music is so vast and, and it's having the ability to do that problem solving process. Okay, I have had a problem kind of like this before, and in the past I used this strategy, so I'm going to try that. That didn't work. Okay, let me try something else, right? And I think a lot of times, because my area of expertise is applying the science of learning to practicing, I think people think that doesn't happen to me, that I always know like the perfect practice strategy for every problem. And that like couldn't be further from the truth. Sometimes I do, right? A lot more often than when I was younger and I didn't know stuff. But I still have the exact same experience. I'll come across a problem I've never encountered before. I'll try my, practice strategies that I think are going to work, that I've tried for similar things in the past, but sometimes they don't, right? And I have to make up something new. I think I talked about this in the book, but interleaved clicking up, which I talk about in the chapter on playing faster. Yes. That was something that I made up out of frustration, like maybe 8-ish years ago, for a passage that it was just running 16th notes. It wasn't like it was weird rhythms. Like I've played running 16th notes a million times in my life, right? It was just so unbelievably awkward. And none of the notes, it was a piece I was premiering, so it wasn't tonal. None of the notes fit into any like pattern that I already had. And for the life of me, I could not play it. I tried everything under the sun. And eventually I stumbled across interleaved clicking up, I made it up. And now it's my go-to strategy, just like you said. Like, I probably could have learned that passage a heck of a lot faster if I'd known that at first, but I had to go through the process of finding it. And I think a lot of times people either aren't willing to go through that process of finding a practice strategy that works, or they think that if they have to do that, something is wrong or something like that, rather than understanding that that is part of practicing. That's part of the problem-solving process, is trying different practice strategies, seeing what works. If nothing in your tool bag works, then you have to make something up until something works.
Yeah, and you alluded to this earlier as well, but there's some big fixed mindset, growth mindset things slithering around in there.
Yeah.
Because the fixed mindset is, well, I can't do it, and I'm not a godlike musician. And the growth mindset is like, well, maybe I can do it.
I just have to find the way.
Apply the right strategy.
Right.
And I do prefer framing it as their effort is required. I'm not saying we don't need discipline, but for me, it's more, you need a baseline amount of discipline to engage in practice, and that is important. But after you have the requisite discipline, it becomes more about strategy, experimentation, than just being really hardcore about practice. Because
exactly.
And yeah, I try to emphasize that with students, and it takes the personal sting out of it a little bit. It does require, like you said, a different kind of discipline, because it requires the patience to actually experiment with this stuff over time. And you might need to do, interleaf clicking up, for example. I think interleaf clicking up 2. Right. So there's the first interleaf clicking up that can be very micro.
That's the one I made up out of frustration. The micro one. Yeah.
Yeah. And I actually find the second one has solved more problems for me.
Yeah.
I don't know why. And like you, I have found that I've practiced in rhythms where you have a passage all 16th notes or something. Yeah. But I actually find that doesn't really solve speed problems for me.
Same.
Practicing in rhythms solves the learning problems early on, but I've never found that playing in different rhythms by elongating a note and shortening another note, I've never actually found that solves speed problems on like Bach pieces that are just running 16th notes straight through. Like I usually find taking a bar or two at a time and clicking it up and then spacing that and clicking that up again, that seems to work better for me.
Right.
So I just don't even really do thorny anymore because it doesn't help solve that problem.
I'm with you. I mean, rhythms for me solve really thorny coordination problems. If I'm having trouble coordinating my left hand and my bow, doing things in rhythms and making the coordination more difficult often helps solve coordination problems, which may be therefore causing speed problems. You know what I mean? Like, it's not actually a speed problem, it's a coordination problem. But I really only use rhythms these days to work on coordination issues between the two sides of my body. The funny thing about rhythms too is sometimes that is the only practice strategy students have. I ask students a lot, like, okay, how are you going to practice this? And it doesn't matter what the problem is. Almost always they're like, rhythms. I'm like, that's not addressing your issue here, but it's a strategy people have heard, right? And so they think, oh yeah, this will solve all problems. Like we were saying before, you have to have the right tool, right, for the problem you're trying to solve. And I'm with you on rhythms. I use them very rarely these days because they don't help me speed up unless the problem is a coordination problem between the two sides of my body.
I found when I was in high school that when I struggled with something, I would stop and I don't know what, I just was playing. I was just playing around. I just didn't, right? But if my fingers wouldn't play this passage as a trumpet player, I would slam the first note down, slam the second note down, slam the third note down, slam the fourth note down until I got through that little tiny measure or measure and a half or whatever. And I would just, come on, like yelling at my fingers. Come on, fingers, do this, right? And I found that solved something for me back then. But how much is experimental still? Like when you are, it's experimental, but you have all the tools, and like I suppose there's more tools to discover out there. Certain people have different issues. Some people can't audiate the thing, so you got to sing, or you got to mental practice, or some people can't, right, coordinate, the bow with your hand, like you said. But I'm trying to look at it a bigger picture. Like, where's this going to go in 20 years?
That's a great question. I mean, that's why I love this. I mean, that's why I just like learning in general. Like, there's always more to learn, right? And like in 20 years, we are limited. We, like as a human society, are limited right now always by the questions we can ask and the technology that we have to measure those questions, right? And the technology piece is really exciting because technology is always advancing, right? In terms of us being able to do all sorts of things. And the technology on us being able to look at what the brain is doing, understand what the brain is doing, how the brain is learning is always advancing. And so there's questions that we can't even ask right now because we don't have the technology to test them. And so we can't even conceive of the questions. But 20 years down the line, we will have technology that allows us to ask and look into really interesting questions. The other thing about asking the right questions, very often I read research on music-related neuroscience things, to put it broadly, and it's very clear to me that the researcher is not asking, either they're asking the wrong question or they're asking it in a way that's going to yield a really strange, bizarre answer because they didn't consult with any musicians. And so I'm very sort of encouraged by more collaboration that I'm seeing between musicians and scientists, or the arts and science in general, so that better questions can be asked so we can get clearer, more helpful answers.
This is actually one of the things I really appreciate about Anders Ericsson's research is that, you know, he obviously studied deliberate practice in such detail, but whenever he talks about deliberate practice in a certain domain, he still says you need to consult the people that are actually masters in this field. Like I can't theoretically tell you how to become a concert pianist just because I've studied like very high level principles of deliberate practice. You need to consult the actual tradition with the people. It's part of the pillar system. I was reading Walter Longo, who's a longevity researcher. He talks about, in longevity research, it's useful to have multiple pillars. There's biomechanic research, there's randomized control studies, there's research on actual living centenarians, there's epidemiological research. And if you just take a one pillar approach, you can think that a certain lifestyle is like the best way to go. But it makes a lot more sense to take a holistic approach. And this is one of the reasons I like your work so much, Molly, is that you're looking at studies that have been done in multiple domains of motor learning and cognitive learning and just all kinds of stuff, but you're also a master musician. I feel like that is just so different than someone who isn't a musician, runs a study on interleaving, and the study is very suspicious in terms of how it was even set up to begin with, and then conclusions about how all musicians should practice are drawn from that. And I think some of your, maybe we'll talk about interleaving a bit, because I think your conclusion about increasing contextual interference rather than just assuming that all massing is bad or interleaving all the time is good, I think it's a very reasonable conclusion to draw, because a lot of people that I've talked to who catch wind of the interleaving, they won't play anything more than once in a row. And I don't think that is actually what the research shows, and it's definitely not helpful for problem solving, because if you need to solve a problem on a passage and you're at that point with the passage, you probably actually do need to play it a couple times in a row to get feedback on what you just did. And if you start interleaving too early, it can actually cause some problems. And there is research to back, a more moderate approach up, but there are often like weird conclusions drawn by researchers if you get into this stuff. Yeah, no, that's true. And what you said about, like ultra interleaving, like never doing a repetition of something, like that's not going to work at the beginning. And this is where the research on interleaved practice kind of starts to interface with the research on variable practice, which is introducing lots of variability into how you're doing something rather than just doing it exactly the same way every time. The research on variability in practice is very clear that if there's too much variability at the beginning of learning something, when you're not very good at it, it's going to be counterproductive, because there's already a ton of variability because you're not very good at it. If you introduce more variability, it's just too much. It's just going to be a mess. It's a disaster, right? And so with variability,
You need to be much more uniform at the beginning when you're not very good. And then once you have the hang of it and you can do it, then you introduce variability. And interleaving is very much the same. If it's too interleaved, the point of interleaving is your brain has to take a break from something, but also kind of reconstruct from scratch. How do I do this thing? And sort of remember on the spot, oh yeah, this is how I play this piece by Bach. Here we go, because that's the skill you need in a performance. But if you don't know how to do that skill in the first place, there's nothing for your brain to recreate, right? And when it's brand new, only doing it once, like that could have been a fluke, right? You need to know how to recreate that. And that's why the repetition piece is necessary. That's why the reflection piece is necessary, like you just said. But yeah, I mean, everything that I read in the research, I have to try out myself first to see how it works. Like, I would never just read something and be like, okay, do this. Because if I don't have the personal experience with it, like, who am I to tell other people what to do? That's why I don't talk about improvisation in the book, as I say in the preface or wherever, because I'm classically trained, like, to the core. I have no experience with improvisation outside of, like, you know, avant-garde aleatoric music where they give you a little cell and you do whatever you want. Like, so I can't speak from an experiential level about improvisation. There's a lot of research out there. I've read it. It's great. But because I can't speak to it from my own experience of applying that, I don't feel like I have any place saying anything about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, fair enough. And I think with some of the research around variable practice and interleaving or contextual interference, it's great to read across domains because it starts to paint the picture that these are widespread, you know, brain phenomenon. It's not music specific phenomenon, but music is its own domain very much. And our standards of accuracy are so high compared to some of the other domains. Like if you read research on interleaving, they're like, oh, this group got 70% accuracy versus 60%. Those are both horrible for us.
Horrible.
Like,
yeah, as a musician, absolutely not. 70%, no.
Yeah, so we need much higher levels of accuracy, hopefully, when we're playing things, and that to me it paints a different picture in terms of what's appropriate. And like this Bach passage I was working on, what I ended up settling on was, you know, setting a timer for 5 minutes, practicing this passage plus two other things that I was already they were like yellow zones. You know, the Bach one was like danger, and these other two things were kind of, I just need to play them once in a while. But I chose not to work on like 10 things at once because I could still feel that this passage, it couldn't handle, you know, doing serial practice with like 10 things. I needed that repetition fairly frequently. I was at the point where I was okay like 5 times in a row, but I needed just a little bit of variability or a little bit of interleaving with that. And then I would come back to it 5 minutes later. Right. And then 5 minutes later. And that's what ended up solving it, was clicking up with a little bit of interleaving, 5-minute breaks, tons of mental practice during the day. Like normally I'd only done it 3 times, you know, 3 spacings. This I just tried, okay, I'm going to play it 3 times a day and I'm just going to mental practice like every hour, pretty much every hour or two. Like even at work, timer goes off, play it once. And that's what solved the problem. Nice. It took like 5 days of that. And, but I could see that my previous experiments where I was doing not as many repetitions that were close together wasn't solving the problem. And so I'm not saying that means that's how my brain works and that's proof of anything. But now if I encounter a passage that has that level of difficulty, that's where I'll go right away. And then if anything that I'm going to try to compare that to will start from that point, you know. Right. And I have a couple others, but yeah, it's interesting when you start, you know, putting all these things together in that way.
Right. I think it's so, I love that you're experimenting on yourself and you're like, well, I tried this because it seemed like that would work, but actually what worked better for me was this other thing. I think that's so important. And I tell students that all the time, or people will say, well, is it better to do this or is it better to do this? I'm like, honestly, I don't know. Both of those sound good to me. Experiment on yourself and see what works better for you, because everything I talk about are just like principles, right? And then you have to take those principles and apply them to you. We are all individuals. We all work in different ways. They're principles of how brains work, right? And our brains work in roughly all the same ways, but everybody is an individual, just like we all have individual faces. We have the same parts on our face in the same place, but everybody looks different. It's the same with how our brains work, right? And so what works really well for you, if I copied it exactly with the exact same problem, likely it wouldn't work as well for me, or it would work in a different way because my brain is different. I might need something, I might need to tweak it. Maybe mental practicing, once every hour or two, maybe that's not enough for me. Maybe I need to do it every half hour, or maybe it's too much for me, right? And so I think experimenting on yourself like you did, I think that's the most important thing, that you take these principles, you're like, okay, this is how the brain learns in general. Here's me or some other musician saying, this is how it works well for me. Let me start with that as a baseline and see, oh yeah, that's great. I'll stick with that. Or I need to tweak this a little bit. This is how it works best for me personally.
Yeah. And I should mention too, the metric for whether or not something worked is not how good I'm playing it when I'm practicing.
Right.
It's the next day, cold first
Exactly.
That's a much better metric. And that's how I really feel about interleaving in general. It's such a powerful strategy. It can seem like in general, you're not getting into flow with the passage when you're not doing it like 10 times in a row, but it generally speaking, in my experience, it's a better representation of how well I can play something cold.
Right.
If I have 5 little passages of like 4 bars or a bar or whatever it is, how well I can play them interleaved is pretty much how I'm going to play them when my heart's pounding and I'm performing.
Right.
And yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, interleave, that's such a hard thing for anybody to get their mind around, that it's not how well you can play it while you're practicing it. It's when you come back to it the next day, that really tells you how well you practiced, how well you can play something. And interleaved practice in particular, you don't really feel the benefit of that practice technique until you come back the next day. In my practicing class, the interleave, most of the assignments are like, do this practice method, whatever I lay out in the instructions, video yourself, watch it, and then reflect on it. The interleaved ones in particular are, do this, come back to it the next day, see how it is, then assess what you thought of the practice method.
Practicing in and of itself doesn't do the learning.
It's the break.
Rest.
Exactly.
It's the rest in between. It's the malleation, right? And it's also the coordination of those ensembles of neurons that have to solidify.
Exactly.
They have to get stronger. And the only way they can do that is go to sleep or stop.
Exactly. And that, I was talking to a friend, I forget, recently, who used to be big into like strength training and that kind of thing. And they were like, oh, it's exactly the same as building strength, right? You don't get stronger while you are lifting the weights. You get stronger while you're taking a rest. And anybody that's into strength training knows that. It's the rest when your muscles rebuild themselves and get stronger. And that makes sense to people. It's the exact same thing with our brains. The input that your brain needs is the practice session, but the actual change is when you take a break.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about mental practice maybe for a few minutes, because mental practice is wild. And so my own personal history with mental practice, I grew up doing tons of mental practice, not knowing how good it was for you.
Oh, wow.
I used to hold my arm up like it was a fretboard.
Yeah,
and
my
play on friends in English class, I'd be like describing something I was worried, and I was mental practicing all the time. I would sing along with the motor movements, and I didn't realize, and I think when I was in grade 12, I read a book called The Mind's Ear, and it had a bunch of these mental practice exercises. It's a really thin book. Imagine a C major scale being played by a trumpet mid-range. Now imagine it, or orally audiate it in your mind. Do that piano and trumpet. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. And I already did that, and it just seemed to make intuitive sense to me. I didn't realize that that probably had a humongous impact on my guitar development when I was younger. Because not only does mental practice, have these benefits that we'll get into, you're also spacing the learning out typically when you're doing it. So, I'm playing guitar in the morning before school, and then mental practicing in English class, and then I have guitar class at school, and then I'm mental practicing like while I'm driving. Like, it just starts to get ridiculous how complementary mental practice can be. And I personally feel like the research could potentially be undervaluing mental practice, because when you look at the studies on mental practice, there's no metric for how good the people are at mental practice.
Right.
Often, we don't know. Some of these people might not be that great at audiating the pieces they're playing, and then other people are getting insane value from mental practice because they can audiate the harmonies and the melodies that they're playing. But how did you get involved with mental practice? Like, what was your history with learning about mental practice, and where you started and where you are now?
I'm laughing because it's sort of a funny story. So the first I had ever heard of mental practice was when I was 15. I got tendonitis really badly in my wrist, and I had to take the entire summer off from practicing. And then I had to come back very slowly to playing so I didn't re-injure myself. And at that time, like, teachers and other musicians were like, "Oh, you must mental practice a lot." And I would say, "Oh yeah," like, to be polite. But like, in my mind, I was like, "What the heck? That's such a waste of time. Like, why would I do it in my head, like, and not just on my viola?" So that was my first introduction to it. And my reaction was, what a waste of time. Why in the world would I do something like that? Which is unfortunate because it would have helped a lot when I was recovering from my injury, but whatever, I was 15. So I didn't actually learn about what mental practice was and how beneficial it is until I got to New England Conservatory, until I was a grad student, and I started actually reading the research, and I was like, oh, I was very naive. I didn't know anything about this, and I started mental practicing because the research was clear of how beneficial it was. I started doing it like for real. One summer I was working for what was it called? It was like the Institute for Music and Brain Science or something. It was an initiative at Harvard, and I was their summer intern, I guess, but I was paid. Anyways, I was there like at the lab all day, 9 to 5. It was a 9 to 5 job. I had an hour for lunch. I don't need an hour for lunch. I need to practice. So the first day I brought my viola, ate my lunch, and I whipped out my viola to start practicing in my office. And immediately someone knocked on the door and they're like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "I'm practicing." And they're like, "You can't do that here." And I was like, "Why not?" Like, and in retrospect, like, obviously, why did I think I could practice in a quiet lab? But anyway, so I was like, well, I can't practice. I have all this music to learn. I guess I'm going to have to mental practice, because at that point I knew the benefits of it. I just never really done it. And so every day that whole summer, I ate my lunch, and the rest of the lunch hour, I mental practiced my music. And that's when I really started learning how to do it. I started really seeing the benefits of it for myself beyond, what I'd read in the research. So yeah, that's my very silly history with mental practice.
No, that's great. I currently at my office job, I actually eat lunch before lunch. I eat lunch 15 minutes before lunch, and I try to have something that is acceptable to eat while I'm working.
Yeah.
And then I use the half an hour lunch break to
practice.
To just go for a walk and do mental practice.
Oh, nice.
Okay, so when you're doing mental practice, what exactly is going on?
Yeah, good question. So I should also say, I think I talked about this briefly in the book. I have aphantasia. And if people listening don't know what that is, strictly defined, aphantasia is the inability to see things in your mind's eye. So you can't imagine what something looks like and it be a visual thing. But aphantasia is multi-sensory. So for me, I can't see or hear anything. It's dark and quiet in my mind, but I can imagine what things feel like, and it feels very akin to actually moving. I can imagine what things smell and taste like, and it's very akin to actually smelling and tasting them. So for me, it's limited to vision and what I can hear. And so when I mental practice, I think it's probably quite different than people who can actually hear things in their mind. So when I mental practice, I am trying to imagine as vividly as possible what it feels like to play whatever I'm trying to play. So I'm trying to feel very vividly and very specifically what exactly my fingers have to do, their relationship to each other and the instrument, what my bow has to do, how the entire package of what it feels like. I am also imagining exactly the sound I want and how it sounds. But because I have aphantasia, it is not sound-based. And this is so hard to describe because language really breaks down. It's conceptual. I don't literally hear anything, but I know how I want it to sound, and I can hear it in quotes, but there's no sound. And so I'm trying to imagine, I'm trying to make sure that I can hear like the right pitches and the right rhythm, even though I'm not literally hearing anything. And also like the quality of sound I want in terms of like volume, tone color, vibrato, like everything that goes into sound, that I know what that is, and that I can hear it, and that I know how to create that on my instrument. Like I can feel what it would feel like to actually create that sound.
Mm-hmm.
So what I hear is that you're not audiating.
Yeah,
that can't be possible to me to be at your level.
So this is
but it's like you're only audiating when you're performing, and you can't audiate when you're not performing because it's not the sound, or is it like everything that you audiate is been turned into audiation through your kinesthetic, and feeling bits?
I don't know how to answer this. I've had the funniest conversations with people about this because language breaks down really, really quickly, and you start sounding like you're stoned or something because you're like, what does it mean to hear something?
Yes.
So,
because hearing is physical and audiation is mental. It's like imagery to your eye, audiation to the ear.
Okay. So
right? You can invent things.
Let me make an analogy here, because this is how for a long time I didn't know if I had aphantasia because, like, again, the language is just this huge barrier. So the way that I figured it out was several years ago. My mom posted a picture on Facebook of the apple pie she had made for Thanksgiving. And I have eaten my mom's apple pie like countless times in my life. I saw that picture and I felt like I could literally smell and taste that picture. I don't know if you've had that experience seeing a picture of food. Right? Okay. Yeah. And like, obviously I knew I wasn't tasting it.
Your description of orange in the book.
Exactly. Right. Like, obviously I knew I wasn't tasting or smelling the pie, but my experience of seeing that picture and being like, wow, I can like literally taste and smell that, like those sensations were very close to actually tasting and smelling the pie, even though I knew it wasn't literally happening and I wasn't hallucinating. When I imagine what something sounds like, it has nothing to do with actually hearing something. It has nothing to do with actual sound, which is so hard to describe to someone who can actually hear something. I have in my life actually heard things in my brain. If I listen to something, I recently drove across the country from Arizona to Boston, and there was one day that I just had this playlist on repeat for like the whole day of the drive. And a couple hours later, when I was in my hotel room, just like chilling, I thought I was hallucinating. Like I literally heard those songs that I'd been listening to for hours. I'd had that experience before. And I messaged a friend who I've talked to about this, and I described what was happening. I was like, I feel like I literally hear this in my brain right now, even though obviously I know it's not playing. Is that what it's like for you when you like hear a song in your head and they're like, yeah? It's like, wow, that's really distracting. I'm glad that doesn't happen to me all the time. So what I'm hearing in my head does not have sound attached to it. There's only sound attached to it if there's actual literal sound like coming out of my instrument or coming out of speakers or something, except for on the rare occasion when I've listened to something for hours on end. But I do know what it sounds like, but it's not sound based. Yeah,
I wonder if I wonder if something is.
It's like a synesthesia of sorts, isn't it? Like a crossing. It's not. It's parallel, but as opposed to.
Maybe I don't know. I wouldn't say it's akin to synesthesia. That seems really different to me. But I mean, but it's the same with something visual. Like if you tell me to picture something, I'm not seeing anything. There's no visual information attached to it. But like I could describe to you like the layout of my apartment, for instance, and like see it in my mind's eye, but there's no visual information. I just like know where things are and how they look.
That's my experience with the visual field. And what's very peculiar about this, I have visual aphantasia. I can't, if I look at a plant, there's nothing there. I kind of have a conceptual outline of it, but there's no actual like image there.
Yeah.
But I can see a guitar fretboard extremely vividly in my mind. And it looks like the notes are lighting up, and I feel like I could dance on the notes with my individual fingers or play them with mallets or play them like I would play. And so I guess I've just trained that. But it's funny when I've talked to people about mental practice, like I am predominantly audiating the sounds. That is like the predominant experience. But this visual and kinesthetic component is also very active. And I remember describing this to students, and they're like, oh, I can't see things in my mind like that. I can't see a fretboard. And it's hard for me to translate, but because I can't see any other thing. I can like guitar fretboard and a piano keyboard are there, but nothing else is there visually. So I don't know exactly what happened to me, but I've been mental practicing since I was like
So, Molly, 13. Do you compose?
No, I don't. And I can't, it's funny. I don't compose and I can't. I'm a very bad composer. And
you're reluctant to learn improvisation.
Yeah, I mean, one of my professors, when I was doing my doctorate, one of my theory professors, he's a composer by profession. And so many of our theory assignments were actually composition assignments to apply the principles we were learning. And the feedback I always got was, these are technically correct and following the assignment, but not very creative. I was like, yes, I would agree with that. They're pretty dry and boring. So yeah, no, I don't compose. Okay. I've never composed.
Has anybody ever given you a little passage and listened to the second passage and say the same or different?
Yes. I mean, that's the standard test for amusia, to see if someone has amusia. And that I have a very poor musical memory, probably because I can't hear things. And I can do them because I'm a trained musician, right? And I have other information I can rely on to tell if it's the same or different, but those are like weirdly difficult for me.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. No, it's fascinating to hear.
It is fascinating.
But in terms of mental practice, I mean, people that aren't familiar with it, I think it's very natural to have the mindset that you had when you were a teenager.
Right.
So it's like,
why would I do that? Time.
Right. And specifically, like, let's say hypothetically, there's no issue of physical injury. If you have 6 hours a day of time to physically practice versus being able to split that into some mental practice and some physical practice, I think splitting it is a great idea, even if you take physical injury out of the equation, because mental practice is like, it's a very raw form of retrieval practice in my experience. And trying to summon the melody or the audiation or whatever it is, the tone color, it proves to yourself that you're actually running this from your mind and not waiting for feedback from your instrument. I mean, I can only imagine. I play a fretted instrument, right? But if I played a violin or a viola or a fretless guitar, I mean, you have no hope. If you're not audioing the notes you're playing, you're not going to land where you need. You're gonna do that thing where you land on the note and then correct it after, which is exactly what you don't want.
Right.
And I think that's why programs like Suzuki and other ear before sight programs in terms of learning music are so effective, because they put that at the center stage.
Right.
But I think it is counterintuitive for people that this is a good use of your time. I mean, I had never heard of this study that you referenced in the book with the classical guitarist. Could you share that with us? Because I think that study is fascinating.
Yeah. So that's the one where I wrote the book. I should know it's in my own book. That's the one where they had like 10 days or whatever to mental practice and learn something. Is that the one you're referring to?
Yeah, 10 days, and I think it was one group, half an hour
of mental practice. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so there were two groups. One, they had the same schedule of practicing, which was every day they practiced for half an hour. I think it was for like a week, but check that I'm right in my book. Anyway, right. They had half an hour to practice each day, and the physical practice group did 30 minutes of physical practice, and they were trying to memorize whatever it was they were learning. The mental practice group was instructed to mental practice for, I believe it was 20 minutes, and then physical practice for 10 minutes. So it was the same amount of total time every day, but it was much less actual physical practice. And then at the end of the week, they came and they had to perform this piece from memory as best they could. And at that point, it did look like the mental practice group was pulling ahead in terms of their ability to play the piece from memory, but it wasn't statistically significant. The real difference, which was fascinating to me, came 10 days later. So they had them take 10 days completely off from practicing, or from practicing that piece anyway. And then they had them come back to the lab and perform the piece again from memory. And at that point, it was very clear that the group that had done mental practice was able to perform it from memory much more successfully than the group that had done physical practice. So
mental practice is kind of, so it's audiational to me, but imagination. You're causing your brain to work when you don't have the stimulus actually feeding along with it. So that it's more work for the brain to do it on its own.
Way more work.
Right? And so you're hardwiring a little bit better those channels that need to happen when you're actually, performing and playing for the test.
Exactly.
I suppose that's my theory about it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, with mental practice, you have to be very clear on what you're doing. You can't really go on autopilot, right? Like,
right.
Once you reach a certain level of skill,
it's more intense.
It's much more intense. Like once you reach a certain level of skill on an instrument, you can kind of play mindlessly and your muscle memory will just take over and you don't really have to know what you're doing, right? In order to mental practice, in order to be able to hear it and know that it's correct and feel it and know that you're doing it correctly, and if you were to do it for real on your instrument, it would come out the way you wanted to. You really have to know what you're doing. You really have to know those details and be able to feel them and hear them. And you can't rely on that sort of automatic muscle memory that just sort of goes on autopilot. So yeah, it's much more intense. It takes a lot more concentration. It really forces you to clarify what's supposed to be happening and what you want to be happening and sort of the gap in between them and filling in that gap.
Yeah, I was bored at a seminar once, and I found myself just doing 2-5-1 patterns in my fingers, all 12 keys. And
yeah.
Next, just kind of like, and my fingers were working though, right? I was moving my fingers. When I got to my trumpet, oh my God, my fingers were like drunk.
Oh, okay.
It was the wrong muscles. It was the wrong, everything was wrong, except that I knew the patterns. I had to get over the hump of my fingers being so badly trained. I was training them very poorly, doing this.
Right. It's
when
interesting.
I needed to be doing this. And it's the same fingers. It's,
right.
You think it would be, my fingers were literally drunk for about a week.
Interesting.
On those passages, on those same things.
It's interesting that you said that mental practice is mostly audiation for you, because for me, because I don't hear anything, it's much more physical, but the physical and the auditory, it's both. Like I make sure that not only can I hear it in my conceptual way of hearing things, but also I can feel myself doing it exactly how I would need to do it. And actually that story I was telling of practicing in the lab because I got yelled at for actually practicing, the way that my schedule worked that summer, there was a piece that I was mental practicing in the lab that I didn't actually practice on my viola for probably 2 months. It's a very standard piece for us, so I knew it like orally, but I had never played it. I mental practiced it in that lab for 2 months, and then at the end of the summer, I finally had time to start actually playing it. It was the weirdest experience of my life. It felt like somebody had loaned me a body that already knew how to play that piece, even though I had never played it. I'd been practicing it for 2 months just mentally. It was I could just play it. It was so weird.
There's no way you don't audiate. There's just no way. I just disagree that you don't audiate. There's something else, and it's probably there's probably a way to get at this through fMRI research and put you under for your put you under, and then put Beau under for his lack of visual, and then put me there. I don't audiate near as well as you guys do, but at least I have it. So what's going on in my brain?
Right. I mean, this is whenever I talk about aphantasia, people's brains kind of explode. People are either
it's really cool. No,
other people can hear stuff, or other people can't hear stuff. It's really, really hard to explain. All the Dr.
Oliver Sacks stuff, or there's so many great stories of things that we can't wrap our minds around what possibly can be going on in the brain that makes it so different for you.
Right.
Well, it's like what I'm thinking, it's very possible that...
And it's so cool to have those differences, by the way,
Well, trained musicians with aphantasia may be audiating. They just may not be hearing their subjective conscious experience of their audiation. So just like when you're playing, you're hearing your physical violin or viola. I'm sure that happens all the time. You're hearing your stringed instrument. you may be, when you're mentally practicing, you may actually be audiating, but not hearing the internal representation of that sound the way that someone without aphantasia would be hearing it.
Right. I mean,
there may be two processes going on.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, aphantasia is such a new area of research that like nobody knows very much about it. I think the term was coined in like 2010, maybe even more recently than that.
Oh,
like
really?
It's a very, very, very new phenomena. Well, it's not a new phenomenon. I'm sure it's been around for forever, but it's a new thing scientists have realized is happening, and they're starting to study it. It's when I learned about it, I was like, wait, you like literally hear stuff in your head? Like there's like sound attached? Like that's just like, that blows my mind. There is no sound attached. Or people like literally see things? Like what? That's like so not my experience.
There's in between too. Like,
yeah.
Right,
like
it's a spectrum. Yeah, it's a spectrum. It's not all or nothing. Yeah.
My thing that I always say is like when I talk about audiation, like, well, Van Gogh, let's draw a purple dog. Nobody's seen a purple dog. So
Right.
You draw a purple dog, let's have Van Gogh draw a purple dog. And like, all right, that's a lot of visualization going on there.
Yeah.
Compared to whoever else, right? Unless it's Cezanne or somebody else that's like really got brilliant powers of visualization and color and whatever it is, those distinctions that they need in music. It's like, well, you know major and minor, and you can feel that in your mind.
Right. But it's not sound based. Like, so with your example, like, so with smelling or tasting a picture, my aunt is a professional chef. If she saw a picture of a piece of food, or like a plate of something, like she could imagine how it tastes and smells with far more detail than me, but assuming that she can do that, like both of us are experiencing like the sensation of taste or smell. Like hers is more detailed than mine, but it's smell based or taste based. Mm-hmm. When I imagine how things sound, it's so, I don't have the right words. It is not sound based. It's silent, and it's like this like shadow version almost that is.
The similar thing happens with like really good chess players that can play blindfold chess. Not all of them see a visual chessboard. They just conceptually understand where all the pieces
where things are.
And
right.
It doesn't actually change their calculation or associative ability, because it's not necessarily a visual skill. Some people have a joint like conceptual understanding and the visual representation of that. It's funny with mental practice, like if I'm improvising, like I've studied lots of jazz and I've always improvised, it doesn't feel different than when I'm playing. I can hear what I'm improvising, even though I have no idea what's coming next. I can see it on the fretboard, and I can feel my hand lighting up to play those notes. It's an interesting experience. It's hard to describe to people, especially with students, because I think, when you're describing this to students, you're encouraging them to try this out, but it might just be nothing at first.
Right.
That might just be like, what are you talking about?
Well, and the thing too, I will say also about this. So when I started mental practicing that summer in the lab, the thing that my teacher was really getting on my case about at that point in my life was quality of sound. Really, really having a very clear sense of the quality of sound I wanted on every millisecond of every single note. And that's what my real focus was at that point in my life. And so when I started mental practicing, I was like, okay, well, I need to focus on this in my mental practicing. I didn't know at that point that aphantasia was a thing. I thought nobody sort of heard anything. And so one of the pieces I was mental practicing was the Brahms E-flat sonata. And the first day of mental practicing in the lab, I was like, okay, I need to make sure that I know the quality of sound I want on this first E-flat. And it took me the entire hour to not only get the quality of sound, but to hold on to it, because it would keep disappearing. Now I know as well, it's because I have aphantasia. I'm not literally hearing anything. And over the course of that summer, I got better and better at hearing quality of sound. But again, it's not sound based. It almost feels to me like a texture, like something I could like physically touch, because my ability to imagine how things feel is extremely vivid. So I use that a lot. And now, like talking to you right now, I can imagine the quality of sound on that E flat, but I'm not hearing anything. It's much more of a physical, like I feel like I could like touch it.
Yeah, I think it's the shadows or the periphery of audiation and how it interfaces with whatever else is, your motor cortex has to be going, right? Right. Your other parts of your brain got to be going.
Right.
And And I just think there's so much further west to go, given this conversation. It's like, can I come do a study with you?
Exactly.
Really
no,
fun.
I agree. Like there are so many studies that need to be done on, most of the studies that have been done on aphantasia are in the visual realm. There's so many studies that I want to do with aphantasia to find out, specifically with musicians, what they're hearing or not hearing, because my experience with the quality of sound thing is that it can be improved. Like when I started doing it, I couldn't imagine anything. Now I can imagine quality of sound very vividly. It's not sound-based, again, but I've vastly improved at that, right? I've vastly improved at my ability to imagine what something sounds like in terms of pitch, but again, it's not sound-based. But you can get better at it even if you're not hearing anything.
Do they have a sense of like what percentage of people have it at all? Like
no,
they do with
I'm in an aphantasia Facebook group where it's like people that have aphantasia, and
there's 12.
Right. No, it's actually bigger than you would think, but it's so funny when new people come into the group. They're like, wait, people actually like literally see things, and everyone in the group has to be like, yes, welcome, calm down, it's okay. But yeah, it's really interesting.
Okay, what about when you dream? Do you hear sounds when you dream?
Somebody recently asked me about this. So
because my experience with this, I don't see things very clearly, like I said, unless it's a guitar fretboard, but I dream very visually. And so the brain has the potential
to do that, right? Somebody recently asked me this exact question. So I have always dreamed very visually, to the point that I sometimes get confused with what was a dream and what's real life if it wasn't like totally bizarre and could not have happened in real life. So my dreams are very visually vivid, even though, again, I don't see anything either in my mind. So yes, apparently I do see things when I dream. It's rare that my dreams have any sound in them or music in them, but when that is there, I certainly hear it. And I have definitely had dreams where there's music playing in the dream that I've never heard before, and I wake up and I try to write it down. So I heard it in the dream for sure, even though I can't do that when I'm waking.
But that's the tiniest fraction of all the moments you've had when you don't have music around and you try and...
I do think your experience with like listening to a playlist repetitively and then having some kind of like sensory imprint of it. So I remember when I was really young playing this Game Boy game, and I probably shouldn't have been allowed to play it for 5 hours straight, but I was. And I remember going to sleep and I could hear the exact sounds. Not like when I audiate something now and hear it, it's vivid. But this was different. This was like more of like a physical sensory impression. And I definitely think those things are separate.
Right. I do too.
Sure.
I've had that experience also with visual things. Like if I like get like obsessed with a show or something, or like, and you watch something like obsessively, right? I have also had that experience that you had with the video game, that you can like literally see it exactly how it is. That's like so not even remotely my experience, like most of the time.
Yeah. So in terms of mental practice, let's say in your book, you give this example of doing these 30-minute, 3 30-minute cycles with like a 5-minute break in between. And where are you doing mental practice in there? Is it for a chunk? Is it like couple mental repetitions, couple physical ones? Or how have you experimented with different time uses of mental practice?
Most of the time, I mean, if I'm like somewhere where I can't physically practice, like in an airplane or something like that, then I'll just, mental practice if I have music to learn. But most of the time, like in my day-to-day practice, I am constantly going back and forth between mental practice and physical practice. So often, if it's something that I've been working on for a while and I'm, coming back to it to work on it more today, I will start by mental practicing the passage that I'm going to be working on, to make sure that to kind of see how it is in my head. Can I hear this clearly? Can I feel this clearly? Can I do this the way I want in my head? If the answer is no, like, I just missed that shift in my head, then I'll try to fix it in my head and make sure that I can do it cleanly in my head. And then I'll put it on my viola to see if it translated. If the answer is yes, like I do the passage in my head, it's like, yeah, that's good. I can do it the way I want. I can imagine it the way I want. Then I try it on my viola to see if I can actually do it physically out in the world as well as I can imagine it. If the answer is also yes, then I record it and I listen back and see how it is. Often the answer is no, that I'll play it and it's like, oh yeah, I forgot to imagine this, and this aspect of the passage. And so then I'll either figure out how to do it on my viola if I realize I'm not sure how to do it, or I'll mental practice. It kind of depends on what the issue is. But I'll go back and forth between mental practice and physical practice until I can do it both ways, the way that I want to consistently. If it's something new, I will physically practice it first. Once I feel like I have a handle on it, like physically, then I'll see if I can imagine it. And that really shows me where the holes are. Like, oh, wow, my bow really does not know what I'm doing here. Like, I'm just relying on muscle memory. I really need to be feeling like the string crossings and the bowing. And so I'll mental practice that. Once that's clarified in my mind, then it's much more clear on my instrument. So how much mental practice I do in a day really depends. I would say on average, probably half of every practice session is mental practice. But I'm not like measuring it with a timer or anything. And some practice sessions have way more mental practice. Some have way less mental practice. It really depends.
Yeah, I've been playing around with different strategies like that, kind of mental practice in the sense where it's like 1 or 2 mental repetitions, 1 or 2 physical, and maybe some listening back. And then I've more recently been playing around with just more strict time-based things. Like I'm going to interleave these things for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to do mental interleaving on something else for 5 minutes, and actually going straight up half mental practice with timers. I find that timers are good for me in the sense that it's like time to move on.
Yeah, no, I love timers.
And so I'm actually using I use this meditation app because it has an interval timer on it and it dings.
Yeah.
You probably use Insight Timer.
Yeah.
So I use Insight Timer because you can program it. You can set, ding every 3 minutes.
Yeah, you can.
And
right.
It's just useful for that purpose. And I usually stand up when I do the mental practice because, I'm a guitarist and you're always sitting. I don't really have the option of practicing classical guitar standing up. But no, it's what's probably the most mysterious thing to me is that you can get so dialed into this, you can tell when you're making mistakes.
Yeah.
When you're mental practicing.
Yeah, right.
And that's just wild.
Yeah, it's just wild. Yeah, I mean, people, especially you were talking about fretted instruments versus not fretted instruments. People say to me all the time, well, you can't practice intonation mentally. Like, yes, you can. Pick a passage you always play out of tune. Do it in your head. I bet you anything is out of tune in your head too. And they do. And they're like, oh my God, I'm out of tune. Yes, you are. You can fix it in your head and it'll fix it out in the world.
Yeah. Well, because it's not the viola that's making your note in tune. It's your brain.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But no, I think it's so cool. And it's very inspiring too if you are, well, for many reasons, if you're dealing with any kind of physical injury.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not really a problem. Like if you're recovering from tendonitis and you have to play for like 2 minutes a day, 5 minutes a day, 10 and work that up.
Right.
That's fine. Just do a bunch of mental practice if you want. And I found that, very powerful and inspiring. I also find it very useful because I don't want to be sitting for obnoxious amounts of my day. And I do a lot of mental practice just going for walks.
Yeah, same.
And I find that, and there may be benefit to retrieving information in different locations. It's probably, the effect size is not going to be as big as some of these other, it's not going to be as big as space repetition and the spacing effect and stuff like that. But there can be benefit to reviewing information in different locations.
Totally.
And I just like that a lot. And I've even tried, I'll take lower level, RCM books for classical guitar, like 4 or 5, and I'll only learn the piece mentally.
Nice.
And I'll do an easy piece like that. And you have to choose something you can audiate.
Right.
If it's something really weird that you can't audiate, it might not be the greatest use of your time. But no, it's amazing how far this can go. And also for mental practice, I think the same principles are at play. Like don't have all this strategy, problem solving, like really reflective practice physically, and then mental practice you just run through your pieces.
Right.
You can do these things when you're mental practice too. You can interleave things and say, okay, I'm only working on the tone color. I'm not going to worry about whatever, XYZ. These next few repetitions, I'm just dialing in the phrasing, or I'm dialing in the articulation, and Yeah, it's so cool. I don't think the people at work have any idea how often I'm
your mental practice. No, totally. Yeah,
I work on a computer, right? And I'm just like 30 seconds. I'm just like staring at the computer, but I'm actually going through this like Bach riff.
And you don't do it because you're inconvenienced. The neighbor's asleep, right?
Right.
You do it because it's part of what your practice is. It's as intense or more intense than when you're physically practicing. So you got to take that time in your practice to also concentrate just on the mental piece of it, because your imagining of all the things that it has to all come together without your body.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you add your body. And
exactly.
if you don't have it without your body, you're not going to have it with your body, because what's controlling your body
is your mind. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I find that over and over in my teaching too. Like if a student is having difficulty with a passage, I'll ask them to mental practice it and make sure that they can do it clearly in their mind. And once they say they've done it, I ask, was everything clear, or were you having a hard time imagining any of it? And almost without fail, wherever they're not clean when they actually play it, they're like, yeah, that part is fuzzy. And so once we're able to help them clarify it in their mind and they do it on their instrument, they're like, oh, that was a lot easier. Yes, it was, because you clarified exactly what you needed to be doing. And so then your body has better instructions on how to do it.
Mm-hmm. These poor podcast listeners, there's probably hours of me saying this on recording now, but so often with piano players and guitar players, when there are two lines, even if it's just a bass line, people aren't audiating the bass line.
Right.
It's like they have the motor movement like associated to the melody, but there's no audiation of the bass line. And I've found that to be very helpful to coach people into, okay, can you mentally practice this, even mime it a bit physically, which it seems like a good idea.
Yeah.
But just audiate the bass, like try to pull your attention into the bass and how you're phrasing the bass line. And I found that very useful, because often people don't realize how they're phrasing when they're playing even like a double stop riff or something like that, because the second note just gets tuned out of their awareness just completely. And you can't shape that note unless there's some tracking of it.
Exactly. It's the same thing with bowed string players. When we have double stops, it's always the bottom. If you're going to ignore something, you're going to be ignoring the bottom. Or if there's chords, you're always ignoring the bottom. It shows up in memorization too. Like people will know the top notes of the chords, but the bottom notes, what's going on down there? I have no idea. But mental practice can help clear that up for sure.
And you mentioned similar thing going on when you're working with like a chamber group, where it's really useful to be able to audiate and just track other musicians' parts. And I think we've all experienced this, and like I definitely had this in concert band where I'm playing tuba and I'm lasered in on my part, and I kind of know the melody, but then there's this experience where, and you describe this in your book with a piano accompanist, I believe, where you're like, whoa, I heard that melody for the first time, but we've been playing this song for a year straight in concert band. So there's not even, there's not even a peripheral awareness of the other parts of what's going on. And I've just seen that consistently, like really skilled musicians, they develop skills to audiate either the harmony or the other lines. It's not just all about the main melody or, that's just, it's a cool observation. Whenever I've read books from really good, practice pedagogues, that's always the problem solving and being aware of these other parts always shows up like reasonably high on the list. Cause I think it's so often just like thrown aside.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Yeah. Going back to the aphantasia thing, I cannot hear more than one note at a time. If I'm trying to imagine a double stop, I can imagine how it feels, but I have to like arpeggiate, for lack of a better word, between the two notes. I can't hear them together. Like, absolutely not. I can't hear, like, many musicians can look at a score, right, of an orchestral piece or chambers and hear it. No, absolutely not. I can do one line at a time, but I cannot not even in my shadow version can I hear the composite.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's so cool. Your book is just so well written. Again, I just can't tell you. It's so easy to read, and it sounds like a lot of complex topics, but it's pretty simple and it's really well laid out. And I don't know how many people I've emailed that says, you got to have my niece. She's going to a graduate school. It's like, you got to get this book. I think she's resisted because she's 23. not ready to give up the practice monster.
Yeah.
And
well,
she's
I appreciate that.
Very good, but I just like, come on, this will give you another leg up. And,
right.
But Uncle Eric's that weird guy, though.
Right. I know. I get that too. Yeah.
I'm on the outliers out here.
Got it.
I love it. But
yeah, I mean, I really wanted to write this book in a very sort of accessible, easy to read way, because it is a lot of info. I feel like the book is a little bit of a fire hose of information. It's just like a lot of information. So I really wanted to make it as easy to read and as accessible as possible. People say when they read it, they feel like they can hear me talking.
Yes,
because it's very sort of conversational.
It's very relatable. It's very relatable, and it's also got a flow to it, and the information is there. And because I was used to your website a little bit, and that some of the concepts have already been there, but this helped nail it down for me,
awesome.
even more so, and introduced me a couple other things that I hadn't picked up. I'm standing on my head for it, but that won't help.
There's a part in the book about correcting errors, about old way, new way.
Yeah.
I'd like you to describe this, because this is one of the other things where a lot of these other concepts I had heard about, and then you bring it into the field of music, and it's like the best thing to read about. This is one I had never even heard of. This is one, So what's going on with correcting errors in this?
Right. So old way, new way. Yeah, I had never heard of it. I learned about it first, I think, through Noah Kageyama's Bulletproof Musician website. I think that's the first time I encountered it, and I had never heard of it either. And so I started digging into the research. There really isn't that much at all. The research that exists is the research I talk about in the book. But basically, old way, new way is a way of correcting bad habits that's very efficient and effective. So essentially the way it works so the teacher has to identify, like if a student has a bad habit, the teacher has to identify like what is the underlying issue that's causing this bad habit in the first place, because the underlying issue needs to be corrected. So I give the example in the book. Often string players, you're supposed to have your wrist like straight when you're holding violin or viola, and a common bad habit is that your wrist is bent so that the heel of the hand is up against the back of the neck of the instrument. But when you do that, like you can't shift, you can't vibrate, it's just, you can't play like that. Often students do that because the instrument isn't stable on their shoulder, and so they're trying to stabilize the instrument. So many times the root of the wrist problem is actually that it's not stable on the shoulder because they're doing something funky with their shoulder. So in that case, your job as the teacher would be to figure out what's going on with the shoulder. So then the way old way, new way works is the student does it the old way, the wrong way, on purpose, and describes it in as much detail as they can, so they really become aware of what they're doing that's not right. Then they do it the new way, and again, they describe it in as much detail as they can. And then they have to go back and forth between the old way and the new way, describing it every time. I've done this with students. The describing piece is so important, and you're supposed to alternate 6 times, so you do it like 12 times total. And the alternation piece is the most annoying because every single time, so you do it wrong and you describe in detail what it feels like. Then you do it right and you describe in detail what it feels like. Then you do it wrong and you describe in detail what it feels like 6 times. It becomes very annoying, and the student is like, I just described this to you. Why do I have to do it again? But it's the describing that makes the student really consciously aware of the old habit and how it feels. Whenever I've done this with students, every single time they have to describe it again, they add more detail. So it isn't a verbatim, it feels like this, blah, blah, blah. They always are able to add more detail on every description, even though they're getting annoyed that they have to explain it to me yet again.
But that provides an emotional component, possibly, that
That's
makes
true,
it
actually.
stick.
That's
too,
true, actually.
right?
I hadn't thought about that they get annoyed. And then in the end, they have to do it right, a handful of times and describe it. But it's the describing piece, because when you have a bad habit, often you're not consciously doing it. There's a lot of just, under the hood stuff going on that you just this is how you do it. You're not consciously aware.
Try to cover it up rather than get into it.
Exactly. And so having to put it into words, having to describe what it feels like in as much detail as possible really helps students become aware of what they're doing and how it's getting in their way. The other thing I see when I do this with students is, the description becomes more and more detailed, but often they start adding detail about, oh God, I can feel that it's really getting in my way when I'm trying to shift and I'm doing this weird thing with my shoulder. Like, man, that's really uncomfortable. How did I not notice that before? Ah, good. This is working. And what the research shows is you do this old way, new way intervention once, which in my experience takes up most of an hour lesson, if not the entire hour lesson. And then it's essentially corrected like forever. You don't have to like repeat it because now they're aware of this bad habit, how uncomfortable it feels. And they have the language to describe the new habit. So they know how to do the new habit. And so they're self-correcting.
No, it's very effective. I used it. There was a little chord in this piece I was working on, a weird chord that you don't encounter very much. So it, it was being trained from the ground up. And I found that the melody was in my pinky. And so I was just consciously focusing a lot on that D note, and there was an F sharp underneath it. And what I came up with as the old way, new way, when I watched myself, I kept missing the note with my ring finger just subtly. Like I was just like a millimeter or two off every time I would do this shift and plant this chord. And so my old way was focusing on the pinky, and the new way was I just got to focus on getting that ring finger, because that's the one I'm actually missing. I'm not missing the pinky ever. I'm missing the ring finger, and that just I didn't even do it 6 times. It was like 3 or 4 of each.
Yeah.
And just more focus on that ring finger being planted, and it's just been solved.
Cool.
It's
nice.
just done now. Yeah. And so that's a cool technique.
It makes me feel like I can fix the men's 4x100 Olympic team. You passed this the wrong way. Just pass the baton the wrong way. All right, now go back and do it the right way. Now go back and do it the wrong way again, right? Just why don't they teach them to do it on purpose?
Right, the wrong
and
way.
And feel like, why are they doing it wrong every year? And so they talk about it's not the Olympians, it's the system they've been in. They haven't been taught properly, right? So this whole thing is just funny to me, because reading your book and watching the Olympics, it's like, I could fix that javelin thrower.
Right.
It's like insane.
Well, and the thing, too, with doing it the wrong way, like, you really have to understand what you're doing to do something wrong on purpose, right? It's really easy to do something wrong, not on purpose. But to do it on purpose, you really have to understand how to do it. And in order to understand how to do it wrong, that helps you understand how to do it right.
Yeah, because you don't have, how are you going to know what's right if you don't know that wrong is not right?
Exactly.
Yeah, the intentionality between being able to consciously go back and forth, I think that's a key part of this.
Right.
There's a great guitar player, Douglas Neat. He has a wonderful website on practicing, and he actually brings up your resources quite a bit on his website.
That's nice.
He uses this technique when starting a new piece. And he has a series on how to learn a new piece, really worth reading. I think it's like 15 parts or something. It's wonderful. And one of his rules is hesitate rather than err. So if you're unsure that you're going to pull this next passage off, or there's a part that seems odd, you should hesitate before making the mistake and stop. And that's how that's his recommendation for getting into the problem solving mode. And I heard a criticism of this, again, coming from the mindset of like repetitions, and people were like, well, if I hesitate, I'm training myself to stop at that part of the passage. But his whole point is that if you learn to consciously hesitate before you make the mistake, and then, you eventually go back and forth between hesitating and playing it without the hesitation. It's to me, it feels very similar to this. But it just prevents you from,
because you're not having to make a mistake.
Repetitions.
You're having to not make a mistake, and then you can go back. The easier thing to fix is not hesitating, because that's not your problem. If you did that for 2 weeks in a row, maybe
Well, yeah, and what I found with that and this old way new thing is, right when you get to the point where you're about to work on that part that's going to be corrected, the knowledge of what you need to be doing.
Yeah.
And the correction, it starts immediately coming to mind.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening with the old way, new way. The knowledge of the new correction, it starts just getting automatically wired in there. But it's so cool. I'd never heard about that.
Yeah. No, old way, new way is very cool. I wish there were more I wish there were more research on it. There's definitely no research on it in musicians. It's in athletes and vocational training.
What would you, maybe, I want to be conscious of your time, but I'd love to hear you answer this. If you could run some studies, what would you run?
Would you like the list that's in my phone? I literally have been keeping a list
maybe a couple.
for
like,
years.
Yeah, what do you think would be most useful?
So, okay, so
Email
the
me.
number one study that I have wanted to do for probably 20-something years is, so there's research that shows that professional musicians have a motor auditory co-activation. So when they hear something, they know how to play, the motor cortex is activated, and vice versa. I am convinced that co-activation between the motor cortex and the auditory cortex is something that gets formed very early on in like Suzuki trained kids and other kids that get trained by ear first, like we were talking about, versus reading music. Whereas when kids learn to read music as their first experience playing an instrument, that connection doesn't get formed, but that connection is absolutely critical for playing well, for playing by memory, blah, blah, blah. So that is the number one study I want to do, to put either a longitudinal study taking kids that haven't played any instruments, Suzuki trained some of them, don't Suzuki train the others, look at how their brains develop, or to take Suzuki trained kids within the first couple years of playing and traditionally trained kids, put them in an fMRI machine and see if that coactivation is going on yet. So that's the number one study that I really, really, really want to do. Because the whole training by ear thing, that's a soapbox issue for me.
Yes,
well,
please.
I mean, that's this whole podcast is that issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Have you
all we
found
talk
that
about.
these same tools that we use for practicing apply to a 4-year-old beginner?
Yes, you just have
It's
to make
like
them into
it's
games.
just that they might need more block
Right.
early
No,
on.
that's a great question. I mean, so interleaf practicing and spaced practicing seem to be fundamental concepts about how all living things learn, not just like humans, but like single-celled organisms even. So, right, or mice or whatever, right? Yeah. And so like certainly they work for children. When I've implemented these ways of practicing with children, I make them into games because that's fun and they're going to be more engaged and then they're going to learn more. I would love to do studies on little kids learning music with, looking at interleaving or something like that to show specifically in little kids how it works.
Yeah, there's parallels to direct instruction with like spacing things out and making sure the kids really have it down. And but then you got to come back to it to see if it's stuck.
Right.
Because if it didn't stick, then you didn't teach anything.
Right, exactly.
Right? And what do you got to do to intervene so that it does stick? And so I've been experimenting with this terribly for the last 2 or 3 years. And I've made a hell of a lot of progress, but I think I've made more mistakes than the progress.
When Eric says terribly, he means he has 4-year-olds that can identify like 10 harmonic functions
Nice.
right here,
Well, not 10,
and give you like Roman numerals. For
I got anyway, but then when they come back the next year, after the summer off, like what is it that I have to do? But the spacing issue is just so fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Because just with these little kids, they're so sponge,
Yeah.
they're the most absorbent sponge in the universe.
Yeah.
And then but they need 10 times or more repetitions, but not every lesson.
Right.
It has to be like, 3 weeks in a row for sure, every lesson, right? What they do at home, I would like them to do this, and that. I tell them, if you want to be extraordinary, parents, tell your kids to do this before they go to bed.
Yeah. Right.
It's just 5 minutes before they go to bed, and then let them sleep.
I suspect that the forgetting curve, which is how quickly you forget something once you take a break from it, is different in kids. Maybe it's quicker, maybe it's not quicker, but I suspect that it's different in children than adults. And maybe that research exists.
There's so many more wrong pathways that are easy to go down by because they have so much more circuitry.
Right. Well, and they don't have as much life experience, right, to sort of automatically shut off some of those pathways and be like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like that can't possibly be.
That's what they call learning after a certain age, right?
Right.
It's like the pruning of all the synapses.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it is amazing that these principles, like the spacing effect and interleaving, they're cross species.
Right.
This isn't a human, like they've done studies on honeybees spacing, which I don't even know how that.
Right.
I was reading this review on the biomechanics of long-term potentiation, which is something like priming neurons for holding long-term memories. Mm-hmm. But the authors had this theory that different spacing intervals could actually be causing different neurochemical cascades. So like reviewing something at 5-minute increments versus 10 minutes versus half an hour, that could be having different effects on long-term potentiation or 1 hour than just doing a consistent schedule.
That's
This got me thinking like, yeah, this is, and so I need to run this like little test with myself again. But this challenge I was having with this section earlier, I did this thing where it was, I reviewed it every 5 minutes for a couple reps, and then I went 10 minutes, and then half an hour, and then it was hours.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was part of what caused this problem to be solved, because I was throwing like all this stuff at it. But I'm interested to play around with that. The idea that irregular spacing intervals could be better than, because we see that with serial practice.
Right.
That usually, if you're at a proper skill level, it's better to do random practice than serial practice.
Right.
And that might be because these different exposure intervals cause different neurochemical responses.
Could be.
But yeah, it's it's the kind of thing where I don't want to experiment with extreme health stuff just from reading a study like that. But practicing stuff,
practicing
it's like,
it,
why not? It's like
it's not going to hurt you.
Yeah, probably not.
Right. I mean, there's so much we don't know. Like, I get questions so often, well, do you think XYZ, or does the research show XYZ? And I'm like, I don't know, and I don't know that anybody knows yet. Like, it's just, I don't know, it's so cool to me that, like, there's so much we don't know. There's so much that hasn't been studied. I think musicians especially, like, we want to know, like, okay, tell me, like, the perfect way to practice. Tell me, like, the magic bullet that's going to solve it.
The research in music education is, bottom line, it's just abysmal. A lot of it.
And the prior knowledge, like you said, with your students studying the same piece, you can't give them your training.
Right, I can't give them my training. Right.
Yeah, like if I start a Bach piece, but 80% of the chord shapes and even the melodic content is stuff I've already mastered before, I'm going to just crank through that piece in a way where if I start a new piece with all these new ingredients, they're not in my long-term memory.
Right.
So I can't just take this generic template. I need some way of changing my strategy, and that's why this I think gets more complicated than just saying I do 3 reps, because if it's a new piece of information, that might be wildly inappropriate for what I'm
Beau's
doing.
Your
but
best,
some of these easier
lab
pieces
rat ever.
Sorry?
Beau's your best lab rat ever.
Oh, I'll just do it. I'll try it.
Right. No, I'm the same way. I'm constantly experimenting on myself, and my students will be like, well, should I do blah or blah? I'm like, do them both. Experiment and take notes and see what works well, for you, unless one of the options is clearly not going to work, right? If they both seem plausibly effective, then try them.
Yeah, you have to be ethically considerate to yourself.
Right, yeah, exactly.
This recent round of like reading your book, and I was rereading a lot of the literature on the spacing effect, it inspired me to practice piano more seriously, because I teach piano, but I don't really practice piano. I'm a classical guitarist, but I'm like, you know what? I should be practicing piano 10 or 15 minutes a day.
Yeah.
And it's wild how much you can get done if you're actually doing proper, practice techniques. And
right.
It's been a lot of fun.
That's awesome.
Tons of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, too, that people say to me often is they're like, okay, I watched your videos or blah, 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 I've, consumed your whatever, and I actually enjoy practicing now. It's like, when you have good practice strategies and you understand that it's a creative problem-solving process and you're just drawing on these tools, it becomes way more enjoyable than just banging your head against the wall and brute forcing it.
If it's not fun, right, how much more are you learning when you're having a good time doing something than when you got all the cortisol coursing through your veins?
Exactly.
It's just, If you get angry at something, well, good. Then drill down a little bit. Use that for a minute. But if you stay angry, you should probably take a break.
Right.
That was something else I wanted to mention. Like early in the book, you talk about this study. Noah did a cool on Bulletproof Musician. He did a cool blog post about this a while ago. But it was like they had a bunch of people. I think it was a Shostakovich passage.
Oh yeah.
And they filmed all their practicing. They brought them in a lab. You can practice as long as you want. Come back and play this tomorrow. And so it was very open. But the top 3 practicers, from what I remember, they were really making sure they weren't doing incorrect repetitions.
Right.
And I've said this for so long on the podcast because of the research in direct instruction, that your success ratio on first exposure, even, and definitely consecutive trials, can have a big influence on how well you retain the material. But we often see this narrative where it's like, mistakes are good, you just drive through them, just all the effort, brute force. And that's really not what you see when you see people who are really with a fine-tooth comb studying learning. It's not a good idea to have tons of errors. It actually, and we get weird messages about that because, on one side, growth mindset is very valuable and we want to be able to attack challenges, but that doesn't mean make things so hard you can't achieve success. And for me, learning a difficult piece is like, how small do the pieces have to be?
Right.
So is this a piece that's so hard it's 1 beat at a time?
Right.
Or is this a piece where I can handle 8 bars at a time?
Right.
That's really like my first decision. And most of that's being made under the guise of, I don't want to be practicing repetitive errors.
Right.
And I really like that study a lot because it just seems so simple. It's like, and you almost sound like a bit of an asshole when you say it, but the way to practice is just stop practicing mistakes.
Right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I love that study too. And I think the thing that's confusing to people is like, mistakes are going to happen. Like, we're not computers. We're going to make mistakes, and mistakes are necessary for learning, right? But you don't want to practice in such a way that you're forcing yourself to make more mistakes than you otherwise would. Like, more mistakes is not better. You're not going to learn more just because you're making more mistakes, right? And if you, like you said, like, is this a piece I have to learn 1 beat at a time, or can I do a larger chunk? If you're doing too big of a chunk and you overwhelm your working memory, there's going to be so many variables that are so outside of your awareness that you're going to be messing up on that you don't even know you're messing up on because you've overloaded your brain. And so you're going to be making even more mistakes than you thought you were making. And you're going to be reinforcing those mistakes that you're not even aware are mistakes until later in the process, and then you're like, oh shoot, I have to undo this.
Yeah. Taking your own working memory load as some kind of consideration for how much you can handle, I think is a really good idea. And I see teachers having this problem where you look at this like Bach piece in like a Royal Conservatory book that's like grade 3 or 4. The whole thing is one chunk in your mind, basically.
As a teacher.
And so there's nothing as a teacher, there's nothing really challenging. So you have this illusion of, you don't even realize how skilled you are, basically.
Right.
I forget the name of this illusion, this cognitive bias. But so you can inadvertently give students a chunk that's overwhelming their working memory.
Right.
Because for you, it's like,
it's not a big
this
deal.
whole bar is like one chord progression.
Right.
It's not even a big deal. But for them, it's like this note to that note is like that's all the working memory they have.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, it's
we'll be back for the second half of the show after we take a quick break. Oh my gosh, Molly, you're just so generous. I could listen to you all day.
We talked about aphantasia too for like
yeah. That's cool. That's so, I know, that's
brains.
So cool to me. That's just so awesome to me. No, it's just, thank you so much.
It's so fun to bring that up in a classroom because it just explodes the whole class because everybody is like looking at each other like, wait, you don't hear things? You hear things? What? Like,
it's foreign. Yeah, we don't know much about it. So
yeah,
it's a new shiny toy.
It is.
Yeah. No, I'm with you, though. I would really like to see more research
Me
on
too.
the benefits of learning by ear first, because we're all on board with that. And I think all of us have so much experience. People that learn Suzuki or whatever folk tradition or whatever. I mean, I played all by ear, no sheet music for years when I first started. Really.
Push at Peabody to incorporate my curriculum before people do anything else.
There you go.
Cool.
So it's actually shifting a tiny bit. I've actually gotten some support, you know.
But to me, the idea of learning a piece of
like,
music and not having it memorized, it doesn't even make sense. Like, I don't even, like, to me, that's not a, like, I can sight read pieces, obviously, but generally, if I say I've learned something, like, the memory is just
there,
part of, you
right?
know, what comes online. And I think, you know, you've had that experience, and many people that learned through Suzuki or whatever ear first program, but I think that'd be good for the world to have.
It would be good for the world to have,
more
and
proof of that.
I can't tell you the number of times that people who were traditionally trained, meaning they learned with music from the beginning, who don't really know anything about Suzuki, who don't know that I am kind of a Suzuki person, have kind of badmouthed Suzuki to me, saying, "Oh, it's, you know, students that learn by ear, they can't do blah 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 blah," and they, like, I just want research to hand them and be like, "You are wrong. Here you go," because to me, as a player, as a teacher, it is so evident that learning to play by ear is. I think every single person who learns any musical anything should learn by ear for at least the first 6 months of their playing. Like, period. I don't care what instrument, what tradition, what anything. But I would like research to like actually point
like
to.
For 10 or 20% of the population that thinks of themselves as musical because they read music. Right? And you're not, if you don't, or you're not able to handle like the orchestra, the real stuff that you need to read for.
Right.
Because, you know, Bon Jovi doesn't need to read music. He's making money. He's doing great, right?
Right.
Joni Mitchell, one of the greatest artists of our time, doesn't need to read music. She's
but the thing is, in
beyond
classical music, like, it's one thing if you come to me for, you know, rock guitar lessons, people are like, I don't care if I read music. But when they come for like jazz or classical lessons, people get very serious. They're like, if I'm not reading sheet music, like, I'm basically just wasting my time.
But there are people who start out reading and they get the ear stuff down right away because that's their nature. They've got the high music aptitude or other things that go into that. The motivation is crucial, right? If you're highly motivated, it doesn't matter how you're going to learn. You're going to get through it somehow. And so that 10, 20% those are the musicians of the world. And we forget that the other 80% are just as valid musicians, and they can get there if you practice well. Right? If you've got you need some motivation, some intrinsic motivation. You've got to want to, right? Because otherwise you won't practice at all. And then, right? So you've got these other things at play that aren't, right? It's your purpose. If you're going to play in an orchestra, yeah, you got to learn to read, but you can do both.
Right.
And it's very clear that the people who learn to read, to me, and there is research out there. It's just not well documented, or it's not in the mainstream. Music education abhors this kind of research. Same way they trashed direct instruction, the best reading and math program in the universe by far. Not even close. Just not even close. And we don't use it, but just rarely. And it's just want to rip your eyeballs out and ears.
I feel like Suzuki with fretless stringed instruments, violins, violas, cellos, makes so much sense too, because those instruments ruthlessly expose when someone's not audiating when they're playing. Because on a piano, you can fake it. It's like, I know the C's here, the G's here. Even on a guitar, you can just conceptually understand where the note should be. But on a fretless instrument or using your voice, it's just easier to be able to audiate what you're playing and produce the result. And I think that's why basically Suzuki became so popular for those instruments. Like I know a great Suzuki guitar teacher in Vancouver, and the results are just as impressive as with the fretless, you know, traditional stringed instruments. But those instruments are very exposing of people who are playing with, you know, just motor memory or conceptual memory and not listening to the pieces even. And I think that's another thing that's very evident, is that listening to the pieces you're working on, especially when you're a beginner, it's so crucial for development. Right.
Well, the other thing sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to tag my last point is the people that say that to you about Suzuki are part of that tiny percentage.
Yes.
That had it both from the get-go. And they had all the, you know, silver spoons they needed to do it well.
Right. Yeah, it drives me crazy when I get those comments, and I have to be very polite, but I would like research to be like, here, you are wrong. What was I going to say? Oh, something that happens very commonly, actually, with fretless stringed instruments, bowed stringed instruments, is students who haven't learned by ear from the beginning, they've just learned from reading the music, is, for instance, the difference between, so when you start a string instrument, most of the time if you start on violin, everything you're playing is like an A major or D major. So you have C sharps, G sharps, F sharps, which is known in first position, the position we start on, as a high two, that second and third finger are touching each other. And then as you get more advanced, you learn low two. So like C natural, F natural, G natural, something like that. And it's very, very common that kids who don't learn by ear have a really, really, really hard time playing the right one, C natural or C sharp, because they can't hear the difference, right? And so they very often mix up high two and low two, because to them it's an arbitrary difference because it doesn't really sound that different. So why is their teacher making this big distinction between, oh, that one's a high two, that one's a low two, when they can't hear a difference?
It's conceptual and theoretical versus audiational.
Right, exactly. And then Suzuki trained kids, sure, it happens because physically it's a different movement and you get confused, but they can hear that, oh, that note isn't wrong, that note isn't right? And so there's a reason why there's a high two versus a low two, rather than it just being this thing that their teacher is making them do that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, we see the same people with, I know this is in your wheelhouse, but, teaching people to improvise. I've taught so many jazz guitar students to improvise, and the ones that learn to do it through audiation versus through conceptual understanding, like, okay, this riff should work over this chord, or this arpeggio works over that chord. It just is not fast enough. It doesn't work.
Right.
And I'd rather have someone just learn licks by ear, by memory,
right,
and then we learn to vary those musically, like let's add another rhythm to this or take away a note here. And it's the same phenomenon. The people that learn it, and I am the biggest fan of learning music theory.
Yeah, me too.
I just think it has to be, it has to be linked to the sound. Everything is, for me, there's like I'm even down with visual images of the fretboard while I'm playing, but the predominant part of my experience is what I'm audiating. And everything else is kind of tacked onto that. But you see this, you see the same thing in improvisation. That's interesting. People that learn improv conceptually, it's horrible. No,
I mean, music is sound, right? That's what it is. And the conceptual, I'm a huge proponent of theory too. Like, you have to understand conceptually what's happening at some point in the process. But like, that shouldn't be the first part of the process. It needs to be grounded in the sound.
And it's often not the part that people want when beginners show up for lessons. I mean, I've had remarkable experiences taking people with 6 months of traditional piano lessons, and you just start them by ear. Tell me 10 songs you like to play. These 5 are realistic for you to start with, just by ear, just motor memory, by rote. Let's do that for a while before.
Molly, it's like giving a 2-year-old a book, and you just don't. I mean, they'll chew on it. That's good.
And look at the pictures.
And they look at the pictures, and you can read it to them, and all that's great. All that experience is wonderful. But you're not going to expect them to come back and then play the first 2 pages. I like Bob. Bob is my friend, or whatever it is. That would be an early reader, but that would be 4 years old, not 2. But it's like taking a 2-year-old, and giving them a book. That's what a 4-year-old is, and giving them music. It's the same thing. They don't have enough vocabulary. Unless they've been in my class. And then they've got enough vocabulary, but they're not ready for the symbolic representation of that. Because they don't understand necessarily the differences. But as soon as you know the differences, boom, you're off and going. I teach right way, wrong way. Here's twinkle major, twinkle minor. I don't say major minor. It's just, which way do you want it? Because the kids love it the wrong way. I've got some kids who hate it. Just like, I can't stand it. And those kids are just... It's just really interesting to me, and I need to do a study on, like, who's higher aptitude, the ones who really dig it the wrong way, or are they just being the boys in the room, the classrooms,
oppositional defiance.
It's like, and I just mess with the kids' minds when they're ready, and so they can understand differences. When they understand those differences, that's when reading is valuable. And when you're teaching kids to read, without that understanding, and there's some kids that come, Yo-Yo Ma probably came with that.
Yeah.
At that age, or Mozart certainly did, right? Just already had it. So, but you've got to teach the ear, or you're just avoiding what music is, because it goes through your ear, not through your eye. And
exactly.
And when you look at it, you should be able to audiate what you're seeing, but that's only if you've been brought up to play.
Right.
Bite ear first, and this is what it looks like. Oh. But then what's represented on the page is only 5% of, how legato is legato.
Right.
And what's the difference between this guy's legato and that lady's legato? And what, why is that a romantic legato versus this? Or I don't know. We don't know what the connection of those things is, except through audiation, because you can't write that much information down. You just can't write it down. It's so limited. That's one of the things
I like about the Suzuki method or ORF or Gordon stuff, is that there's some education geared towards the parent. So the parent gets some understanding of the learning process of, let's do a bunch of stuff by ear. And my experience, if someone contacts me because they know I have a skill set in doing that, the parents are on board. They're like, let's do it like this. And I'm assuming your experiences with people that are reaching out to you because of your Suzuki training, a lot of them are already on board with that process. So it takes less, convincing and cajoling. Right.
Yeah. Usually. I mean, I used to be just a Suzuki teacher. I haven't been I'm Suzuki trained. I guess I'm always a Suzuki teacher, but I haven't been a Suzuki teacher in 10 years or something now. But yeah, I mean, it used to be that, people that were coming to have lessons with me anyway were kind of already on board, or at least open to being on board, that I would explain what the Suzuki method was, how it works, and then they would be on board with it. I never really had to deal with pushback from parents. It's usually other teachers who aren't Suzuki teachers who don't understand how Suzuki works, and they just have a bunch of harmful myths in their head that try to tell me that, well, no, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, actually... One day I'll do that study, and then I'll have something that I can.
I've only had the resistance from piano parents, never from guitars.
Interesting.
It's never ever. It's a cultural thing for sure.
Get your claws into the NEC prep program.
Yeah.
Right? Get your claws into the NEC prep program.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, this year NEC, lots of things are up in the air still. It'll be an interesting year.
I'm sure. It's a mess everywhere. I so appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back. This is great.
Yeah, when's your next book come out?
When I have time to write it.
I'm sorry. Bo
it takes forever to get a book out. This is 3 years, more than 3 years.
Yeah, no, I know.
That's a long time.
You're the best. All right, thank you. Thanks, Beau.
Yeah, thank you.